It was a typical morning at Sacramento International Airport, or so Malik Torrance thought. The hum of travelers rushing to their gates, the faint sound of announcements echoing through the terminal. It was all part of the routine. But from the moment Malik stepped through the doors, something felt different. It wasn't loud or obvious, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. People glanced at him, eyes shifting away the moment his gaze met theirs. It wasn't like any of the usual airport stress. This felt off as he approached the gate. A flight agent didn't return his polite smile, instead focusing on the screen in front of her. His stomach churned a little. It wasn't his imagination. There was an unspoken barrier forming between him and everyone around him. He brushed it off, though. He had a flight to catch, a quiet trip back to Atlanta after a week spent helping his grandmother with her recovery. Simple, calm, no complications. But as Malik made his way to the boarding area, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He stood there, waiting to board, his hands clutched around his ticket. There was no reason for the sudden anxiety, no obvious explanation, but it was there, gripping his chest tighter with every passing minute. Maybe it was just nerves, he thought. After all, he hadn't seen his mother in weeks. The tension in the air thickened when he finally boarded the plane. It wasn't the flight that would be difficult. It was what would happen after he took his seat that would change everything. The moment he stepped onto the aircraft, he knew. Today wasn't going to be a normal flight. It was about to become a battle, and Malik wasn't ready to back down. Malik walked down the narrow aisle, his boarding pass in hand, but the moment his eyes landed on his seat, 14A, a jolt of confusion shot through him. There was already a man sitting there, headphones on, lost in his own world. Malik hesitated for a brief moment, his fingers brushing the paper ticket as he double-checked. No mistake, this was his seat. He took a step forward, quietly tapping the man on the shoulder. "Excuse me, I think you're in my seat," Malik said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. The man barely acknowledged him, too focused on his music. Malik took another step back, looking around for help, when he saw the flight attendant, T. Delacroix, walking down the aisle. He raised his hand, smiling politely, but her eyes were cold, her face set like stone. She was already moving toward him, but she didn't look at the ticket. "Excuse me, ma'am. I think there's someone in my seat. I'm assigned to 14A. Malik said again, his tone steady, though the faintest tremor betrayed his nerves. She didn't even glance at his boarding pass. "That's not your seat," she snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "You're supposed to be in the back." The words stung, though he fought to keep his composure. What is she talking about? He thought. He knew the seat was his. He double-checked the ticket earlier. But she wasn't listening. There was no chance to explain, no effort to even engage. The passengers around him went quiet, shifting in their seats, but no one spoke up. Everyone was watching. "I was assigned 14A by the app," he tried again, hoping to reason with her. Her gaze hardened, and she raised her voice, louder now. "I don't care what the app says. You sit where I tell you. Now, go sit in the back, or I'll have you removed." Malik's heart pounded. This wasn't just an error anymore. It was something else, something personal. He wasn't being treated like a person. He was being dismissed, erased in an instant, as if his very presence didn't matter. He was the problem, the inconvenience, the one to be dealt with. Why did it feel like I had to fight for my right to be here? The words caught in his throat. Why me? He wondered. Why did it feel like this wasn't just about a seat? Why was she so intent on making him disappear? "Please," he said, trying to remain calm, but his breath was growing shallower. "Can you just check my ticket? I'm not making this up." She glared at him, her patience wearing thin. "Sit in the back or I'll have you escorted off," she snarled, raising her voice even more. The words were sharp, deliberate. This is no mistake, Malik realized. This is her decision, and I'm in her way. All eyes were on him now, his heart racing in his chest. He felt the sweat on his palms, but he wasn't ready to back down. He pulled out his phone, opened the airline app, and held it out toward her. "It says 14A, he said. his voice steady but with a tinge of desperation. The flight attendant didn't even look at the phone. Her arms crossed, and she stepped closer to him. "Are you refusing to follow a crew member's instructions?" Her words were chilling, and suddenly, her authority felt like a looming threat. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was something darker. It was about power. It was about control. It was about making him feel small, invisible. And she wasn't going to let him have a voice. Malik's pulse thudded louder in his ears. But then something shifted inside him. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a quiet, determined resolve. He knew he wasn't going to win this battle with words. But there was one thing he could still control. His finger hovered over the phone as he dialed the one person who could make everything stop. Malik's finger hovered above the screen. His breath shallow, heart thumping in his chest. The flight attendant, Delacroix, stood inches away, glaring at him, her arms crossed in defiance. The weight of her gaze pressed down on him like an anvil. The passengers around him seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for the storm to hit. His hands trembled, but not from fear. He was done with being dismissed. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. This was about standing his ground, about refusing to let someone erase his dignity. Malik's mind raced. "I'm not just going to sit back and let her win. Not this time." Without another word, he reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. The moment the screen lit up, his thumb swiped across it, dialing the number he knew could change everything. His uncle, Xavier Torrance, the attorney who had always been his rock, the man who had taught him how to stand up for himself when the world wanted him to shrink. Malik didn't hesitate. His finger pressed the call button, and the phone rang in his ear as the tension in the cabin grew. Delacroix's sharp eyes flicked to the phone in his hand. "Is that a phone call?" she demanded, her voice rising again. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't answer her directly. He just held the phone up, his other hand still clutching the boarding pass. "I'm speaking with my attorney," he said, the words steady and firm. Delacroix's mouth dropped open in disbelief, but she quickly masked it, narrowing her eyes. "You're not allowed to use your phone during boarding," she barked. "Hang up." But Malik didn't budge, not even an inch. His eyes met hers, unblinking, unwavering. "I'm speaking with my attorney," he repeated, his voice quieter but stronger than before. "I'm not going anywhere." Xavier's voice crackled through the phone, calm and commanding. "Tell me everything, Malik," he said, his tone immediate, confident. Malik barely had to say anything, just the basics. The shouting, the refusal to check his ticket, the crowd of eyes watching him, the injustice of it all. From behind him, someone muttered, "Just let the kid sit down already." Another voice joined in, louder, more assertive. "This isn't right. He's not even in the seat yet." The flight attendant, Delacroix, took a step forward, her face flushed with anger. "I'm going to have you removed if you don't comply," she threatened. But Malik stood tall, his posture solid, not moving, not retreating. Then, another voice cut through the tension. A woman across the aisle, who had been quietly observing, spoke up with conviction. "I saw it," she said. He asked her calmly. She jumped on him for no reason. Delacroix's face twisted with frustration. "Ma'am, please stay out of this," she snapped, her voice strained. But the woman stood firm, louder now. "No, not this time." Malik's heart raced, but he felt a sense of power surge within him. He wasn't alone anymore. People were watching. People were speaking up. His calmness, his resistance. It was rippling through the cabin, growing stronger with every second. Malik's fingers tightened around his phone as he spoke into it again, voice steady. "Uncle X, people are starting to talk. Someone's recording." Xavier's reply was swift and clear. "Tell them to keep recording. I'm contacting the airline right now." "What's the flight number?" Malik read it off the placard above his seat. "B43, 112 to Phoenix." "Got it," Xavier confirmed. "Stay calm. Say nothing else to her. You've done enough." Malik kept his phone pressed to his ear, his heart pounding as the air around him buzzed with escalating whispers. He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore, it was a stand. A stand for himself. A stand for anyone who'd ever been silenced as the flight attendant scurried down the aisle, frantically trying to control the situation. Malik remained calm, his resolve unshaken. In that moment, something inside him clicked. He knew what he had to do, and he wasn't about to let anyone push him around. The plane had come to a halt in more ways than one, and Malik's story was only just beginning. The tension in the cabin was thick, like the air before a storm. Malik stood his ground, his phone pressed to his ear, not budging an inch. Delacroix's eyes darted from Malik to the passengers, then back to him. The murmur of voices grew louder, punctuating the silence that hung heavy in the air. It was clear now, the scene had drawn everyone in. Malik wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a moment of reckoning, and the stakes were higher than anyone had expected. Malik could feel it, the change in the energy of the room. It wasn't just him anymore. He wasn't alone. As he stood there, calm, unwavering, the ripple of resistance spread through the cabin like wildfire. A man sitting in the aisle seat near Malik leaned forward, his eyes meeting Malik's for just a second before he spoke, his voice low but firm. "She's wrong, kid. I saw it. You've been polite. She's just going off for no reason." Malik's breath hitched in his chest, his heart racing not from fear but from something else. Something warm. Something that said, "I'm not invisible. I'm not alone." The man continued, his voice quiet but resolute. "You're in the right. Don't let her intimidate you." Malik glanced at him, grateful but not able to respond. His voice was caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this support, this understanding from a stranger. But it was exactly what he needed to hear. Across the aisle, a woman, one who had been watching the entire scene unfold, stood up, her voice cut through the rising tension like a beacon. "I saw it too," she said, louder this time, turning her gaze to Delacroix. He asked her calmly. She jumped on him. She didn't even check his ticket. Delacroix's face reddened with anger, but the woman didn't back down. "This isn't right. He deserves better than this. You're just making a scene." The flight attendant snapped, her voice now dangerously sharp. "Ma'am, please stay out of this." But the woman wasn't backing down. "No, not this time," she shot back. "This isn't just your problem. It's everyone's problem." Malik could hear the shift in the room, an undercurrent of voices, murmurs of support that were impossible to ignore. People weren't just sitting by anymore. They were watching. They were listening. They were standing up, even if just with their words. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Malik felt the weight of the moment begin to lift. Another flight attendant, one older and more seasoned than Delacroix, appeared in the aisle. His name tag read G. Norrell. He looked uncomfortable, almost nervous, as he approached Malik with caution. "Son," he said softly, his voice calm but with an underlying seriousness. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Malik handed it to him without hesitation. Norrell scanned the ticket, his eyes flicking to the screen of his device. The seconds stretched on like hours, the silence punctuated only by the subtle click of the scanner. "Yeah, you're in the right seat," Norrell said, his voice quiet but firm. There was a last-minute reassignment at the gate. She didn't check the system. The words hit like a thunderclap. Delacroix froze, her face pale with disbelief. She had no response, no defense. The truth was out in the open, and it was undeniable. Malik didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stepped aside, his hand still gripping his phone, as he walked toward 14A. He felt the eyes of the cabin on him, their quiet support humming in the air. The battle wasn't over, but it was a small victory. A reminder that sometimes, standing still is the most powerful thing you can do. As he sat down, the weight of it all still heavy on his shoulders, he couldn't help but feel something new, something stronger than before. I've made it this far. And for the first time in a long while, Malik allowed himself to breathe, just a little easier. Back in Oakland, Xavier Torrance was already on the move. His day had been routine until the moment Malik's call came through. His nephew's calm voice barely hiding the unease. the injustice that was playing out thousands of miles away. Xavier had heard the urgency in Malik's tone, and now he was in full lawyer mode, his mind already shifting gears into action. "I need you," Malik had said, his voice steady despite the storm he was weathering. Xavier didn't need to hear more. He had seen enough. The flight attendant's refusal to check Malik's ticket, the humiliation, the intimidation. It was all too familiar, too predictable. But it was the way Malik had handled it, calmly deflecting every threat, that set the stage for the confrontation that was about to erupt. Xavier moved quickly, pacing the floor of his office, his Bluetooth headset already in place, his assistant Dominique pulling up all the necessary information. He didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He dialed the airline's legal department directly, bypassing the PR lines already on edge. His reputation preceded him. Civil rights wasn't just his profession, it was personal. "Get me a direct contact at Blue Air Legal." Xavier's voice was low but firm, his command cutting through the office like a razor. "Now!" As Dominique scrambled to pull up the contact information, Xavier's mind raced, every scenario playing out like a mental film reel. He wasn't just advocating for his nephew anymore. This was bigger. This was about accountability. About making sure that Malik's dignity wasn't swallowed by the arrogance of someone who thought they could get away with dehumanizing him. The phone rang. The response from the airline's legal department was indifferent. A standard, disinterested greeting that shifted when Xavier spoke his full name. Instantly, the tone on the other end of the line changed. "This is about a passenger on BAE 43 to 12 currently taxiing out of Sacramento," Xavier said, each word deliberate. "My client, Malik Torrance, was misrepresented, publicly humiliated, and threatened by one of your crew members, T. Delacroix. She refused to verify his boarding information, attempted to move him without cause, and threatened federal charges." Xavier's voice was ice cold, unwavering. He didn't need to raise it. He didn't need to shout. The power was in the calm certainty of his words. He had already won the battle before it even started. "I have multiple witnesses, live recordings, and passenger confirmations. Your employees' actions are not only unlawful, they're unacceptable." He continued, the words sharp, each one a hammer strike against the corporate indifference that had allowed this to happen. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy silence. "I'm not fully briefed on this," the junior counsel said, sounding caught off guard. Xavier's response was instant, unrelenting. "You will be. If that plane takes off with Delacroix on it and no official intervention, your airline will face civil action before the landing gear even hits the ground." The phone call was a turning point. The battle was no longer just about Malik's seat. It was about exposing the systemic failures that allowed people like Delacroix to treat others with disdain, to strip them of their rights without consequence. The impact of Xavier's call was immediate. The airline's legal department knew they had a situation on their hands, one they couldn't afford to ignore. Back on the plane, Malik could feel the shift. The energy in the cabin changed as if the entire flight had been put on pause. His phone buzzed again. Xavier's voice came through, calm and collected. "Stay calm. You've done enough. I'm handling the rest." Malik didn't speak, but he felt a surge of gratitude, of strength. Xavier's intervention was more than just a legal maneuver. It was a lifeline. It was the realization that his voice mattered, that someone would stand up for him when no one else would. And as the plane finally came to a stop on the tarmac, the moment of reckoning was just beginning. The passengers, the witnesses, were ready to see how far this would go. Xavier Torrance's intervention had turned the tide, and the flight was never going to take off the way Delacroix had hoped. The hum of the engine stopped abruptly, replaced by a low murmur that spread through the cabin like wildfire. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the sudden shift in the air was impossible to ignore. He kept his eyes forward, his hand gripping his phone tighter, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen." The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, calm yet carrying a weight that no one could miss. "We've been advised of an issue that requires immediate attention before departure. Please remain seated as we return to the gate. We'll update you shortly." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Malik felt the eyes of the cabin on him, but he didn't flinch. He remained still, his fingers still clutching the phone as if it was a lifeline to the world outside. He wasn't sure what had happened behind the scenes, but something told him that Xavier's call had changed everything. Delacroix, the flight attendant who had started it all, stood frozen in the aisle, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Malik could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but he refused to meet her eyes. His stomach twisted not from fear, but from something else, a quiet fury that had settled in deep, a fire he had no intention of extinguishing. He wasn't going anywhere. The plane turned slowly, its wheels grinding as it made its way back to the gate. The passengers, once silent and uneasy, now murmured in hushed tones. A few of them exchanged looks, some nodding in silent agreement with what had just transpired. Others, who had been sitting quietly at the beginning of this ordeal, now seemed to speak with purpose, their voices rising ever so slightly. They were witnesses to something bigger now, something that had caught fire in the cabin, and they knew it. Behind Malik, a few seats over, a woman in a yellow hoodie leaned across the aisle, her voice soft but deliberate. "I just want to say, I saw what happened. I'm sorry that happened to you." Malik turned slightly, surprised by the words. He didn't know how to respond, but he nodded, appreciating the gesture. The woman smiled weakly, her eyes full of empathy. She had seen it all, the unjust treatment, the humiliation, and now she was standing with him, even if it was only with words. Meanwhile, Delacroix was no longer the dominant force in the cabin. The power she had wielded moments ago had evaporated, replaced by the quiet authority of the situation. As the plane glided back to the gate, Malik noticed how the staff now moved with a different energy. They were no longer the aggressors. They were just trying to manage the fallout. When the plane finally reached the gate, the door opened and 2 airport security agents stepped aboard. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew even heavier. Passengers watched in silence, phones now out, recording, capturing the unfolding drama. It was clear that something was about to happen, something important. The energy in the cabin was electric, and the air was thick with anticipation. The security agents made their way down the aisle, and Malik felt a wave of dread pass over him. But it wasn't dread for himself, it was dread for the flight attendant. Delacroix, who had started it all, who had escalated the situation to a boiling point, now found herself in the crosshairs. "Mr. Torrance," one of the security agents said, his voice professional yet slightly strained, "we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. We need to speak with you at the front of the cabin." Malik didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat there, unmoving, until the agents passed by. He looked over at Delacroix as she walked down the aisle, her face a mask of frustration, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't look at him, not once. Not when she passed, not when she turned her back on him. Not even when the airline supervisor appeared to lead her off the plane. And then, as if the silence wasn't thick enough, the supervisor returned alone. She walked directly to Malik, kneeling beside his seat. Her voice was softer now, almost apologetic. "We're terribly sorry for what happened," she began, her tone sincere. "I want you to know that the flight attendant involved will not be continuing this trip." Malik's heart skipped again, but he didn't smile. He didn't even feel satisfaction. He just nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Why did it take a phone call for this to be addressed?" he asked quietly, his voice calm, but with a note of frustration. The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. She swallowed hard before speaking. "Sometimes it takes one voice to wake everyone else up." The truth hung in the air like a dense fog. It wasn't just the system that had failed Malik. It was the people in it who had let it happen. And it was only because someone had finally stepped forward, spoken up, that the wheels of change began to turn. "Let's get you settled," the supervisor said softly. "You've done enough." Malik didn't speak again. He just watched as Delacroix was led off the plane, her head down, her shame palpable. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel like celebrating. But as he returned to his seat, his mind swirling with everything that had just happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not just in the cabin, but in him. And the world outside the plane? It was only just beginning to take notice. The flight had barely resumed when the door opened again, and a new figure stepped onto the plane. A woman in a navy blazer, her face tight with urgency. She was a representative of the airline, and her presence was unmistakable. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as she made her way toward Malik, her footsteps quick and measured, her eyes darting around as if assessing the situation. She finally stopped in front of his seat, where he sat still, waiting for whatever came next. "Mr. Torrance," she said, her voice professional but laden with an edge of unease. "We sincerely apologize for what transpired earlier. This situation is being taken very seriously, and we will be reviewing everything thoroughly." Malik remained silent, not out of defiance, but because the words seemed hollow, as though they were scripted. He had heard apologies before. Empty ones, meant to smooth things over and quickly move on. But this time it felt different. He didn't know why, but something in the way she spoke told him that this wasn't just an ordinary apology. The reality was that things had already gone too far, and now there was no turning back. "We've already spoken with the crew member involved," she continued, her voice lowering slightly. "The flight attendant, Miss Delacroix, will not be continuing this trip. She's been removed from her duties. We can assure you that we will not let this happen again." The words hit Malik harder than he expected. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be the one to make someone lose their job. But there it was, the consequence of someone's actions. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. Relieved, vindicated, or even guilty. But his mind was too tired to process it all at once. "All I wanted was to be treated like a person," he thought, his stomach turning as he remembered the way Delacroix had spoken to him. The woman hesitated for a moment before offering him a seat reassignment slip. "We'd like to move you to 2A for the remainder of the flight. First class," she said, her tone softer now, almost apologetic. "It's not a reward. It's just quieter. And we thought you might prefer more space." Malik looked at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of the offer settle in. He didn't need first class. He didn't need extra space. What he needed, what he had wanted, was respect. But he also knew that nothing would be the same now. Not for him, not for the flight attendants, not for anyone who had witnessed the ordeal. He stood up slowly, almost reluctantly, his gaze falling on the empty first-class seats ahead of him. A part of him wanted to stay in 14A to make a statement, to prove a point. But another part of him just wanted to escape the stares, the whispers, the silent judgment as he made his way toward 2. Malik couldn't ignore the glances of the passengers around him. Some were quiet, others nodded subtly in support, but it was clear this wasn't just a routine flight anymore. The quiet rebellion that had started with Malik's calm refusal had ignited something within the cabin. He had made them see the truth of how quickly someone could be mistreated, how easily a human being could be dismissed. He sat down in the new seat, adjusting himself as he set his bag down. The seat was comfortable, sure, but it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't erase the sting of what had happened. As the flight attendants moved around him, their eyes lingering a little longer than normal, Malik couldn't help but wonder how long the aftermath would last. How long would the memory of this moment linger in the air? Back in Oakland, Xavier Torrance was already drafting a response, one that wouldn't be buried under corporate jargon. The airline had issued their apology, but Xavier wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug with a polite sorry and a free upgrade. Malik's experience was a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue, and Xavier would make sure the world saw it for what it was. But for now, Malik leaned back in his seat, staring out the window. His hands were still shaking, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something stronger. He hadn't just survived this moment. He had changed IT as the plane finally began its journey. Malik's mind was still reeling from everything that had just happened. The cabin had returned to its usual hum, but the weight of the situation lingered. He sat in the quiet of first class, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he hadn't dared to look at. It wasn't just his friends and family reaching out. It was the entire world. Back on the ground, the story had already begun to spread, fueled by the recordings passengers had made. As soon as the plane took off, social media had exploded. The first video of Malik calmly standing his ground, refusing to back down, had been shared thousands of times within minutes. The hashtags #StandWithMalik, #RespectAndDignity, and #FlightFail were trending. Every tweet, every post seemed to carry the same message. Malik was right. He deserved better. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the viral storm was in full force. Journalists were already working their angles, writing up the story of a young black teen standing up to racial discrimination on a flight. The video showing the flight attendant's aggressive behavior, paired with Malik's quiet strength, struck a chord with people around the world. It was the kind of story that cut through the noise, raw, real, and relatable. Xavier Torrance was inundated with calls from reporters, legal professionals, and activists. He knew this moment was much bigger than just his nephew. It was a reflection of a systemic problem that needed addressing. But even as the media storm raged, Xavier held his ground, keeping his focus. He knew the fight was just beginning. But for Malik, this wasn't just about changing an airline's policy. It was about changing the narrative of what it meant to stand up in the face of adversity. Malik sat back in his seat, watching as the texts flooded in. "I saw what happened." One of his friends had written, "You're an inspiration." Another text read, "Your courage is everything. Keep going." But it wasn't just his circle anymore. Strangers were sending messages too, messages of support, of solidarity, and of admiration. People he'd never met were calling him brave, calling him a hero. The next morning, the story broke into national headlines. News anchors discussed the incident, debating the airline's response and the broader implications of racial bias in everyday interactions. Some took a stance of support for Malik, while others questioned the airline's internal training. But everyone was talking about it. Malik didn't know how to feel. The attention, the recognition, it was overwhelming. The flight he had been on, the simple trip home, had turned into a battle that had captured the attention of an entire nation. And while he hadn't asked for this, part of him couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not for himself, but for what the moment represented. His story wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about every person who had ever felt invisible, every person who had been dismissed, ignored, or belittled. Malik knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, he realized something. His voice had power, and that power was just beginning to take shape. Malik didn't have to wait long to understand the full impact of what had happened. The viral videos, the tweets, the endless news stories, they had turned a quiet, personal battle into something much larger than he could have ever imagined. As the days passed, the support from the public came pouring in, but so did the consequences. The weight of both was heavier than Malik had expected at T-School. Malik walked through the halls like he was navigating a different world. Eyes followed him, not with the casual disinterest he was used to, but with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and something else. Something that felt more like pressure. His classmates, who had never given him a second glance before, now whispered when he passed by, nodding with recognition. Some gave him high fives, some avoided his gaze. One teacher, who had never spoken to him outside of class, pulled him aside one day after school. "If you ever want to talk about what happened, my door is always open," she said, her voice awkward, unsure. Malik smiled weakly but didn't say anything. The truth was, he didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? What could possibly make sense of all this? It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about being labeled. It was about surviving. But even now, as people tried to pin him down as a symbol or a martyr, he couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't ready for any of it. What surprised him, though, was the quiet support that came from unexpected places. A janitor named Mr. Daniels, who had worked at the school for years, stopped him one day as Malik was walking through the halls, lost in his thoughts. "You made me proud, young man," Mr. Daniels said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "Most people don't stay calm when the fire's right in their face." Malik had been taken aback. He hadn't expected to hear words of praise from someone like Mr. Daniels, who worked in the background, invisible to most of the students. But in that moment, those words, simple, quiet, genuine, meant more to Malik than anything he had heard on the news. And then, there were the letters, piles of them, handwritten notes from strangers, adults, teenagers, people from all over the country who had seen the videos and felt compelled to reach out. One letter from a woman in Pittsburgh read, "My son is only 12, and I pray he grows up with the same strength you showed." Another letter from a retired teacher in Kansas said, "You didn't just speak up, you showed up. That matters." Malik kept the letters in a box under his bed. He didn't know how to respond to them or if he ever would. But there they were, proof that his story was resonating beyond his own experience, that it was making a difference to people who saw themselves in him, who were moved by his calm resistance. But the consequences of his stand were still unfolding. The airline, despite their public apology and the removal of Delacroix, had begun to face its own backlash. Malik's story sparked widespread discussions about systemic racism, corporate accountability, and how people of color are often treated unfairly in public spaces. The airline stock took a hit. Employees in various industries started calling for better training on racial sensitivity. There were protests, petitions, and demands for change, and Malik's story was at the center of it all. Xavier Torrance, who had been guiding the legal process from the start, was now navigating a sea of media requests and interviews. Malik's name was on the lips of politicians, activists, and civil rights leaders. But despite the growing noise around him, Malik remained largely silent. He wasn't ready to speak for everyone. He wasn't ready to take on the weight of a movement. All he wanted now was to finish school, graduate, and go to college. But life had a different plan for him. His story was no longer just his own. It had become part of a larger conversation. And Malik wasn't sure where that conversation was going, but he knew one thing. It wasn't over. Life had never felt so heavy, the world Malik once knew. His quiet, uneventful days at school, his routine trips back home, had all shifted. His life was no longer his own. The story had spread far beyond the confines of his hometown, and now, everywhere he went, people looked at him differently. His name was on the news, on social media, in conversations that went beyond his control. Malik was no longer just a high school student trying to finish his homework and get by. He had become something else, a symbol. Every time he walked through the school hallways, the eyes followed him, intense and unblinking. He wasn't sure if they were admiration, pity, or just plain curiosity. Some students avoided him, uncomfortable with the attention, while others approached him with tentative smiles, awkwardly offering their support. "You did the right thing, Malik," one of his teachers had said, placing a hand on his shoulder. But what did it mean to do the right thing? Malik had acted out of necessity, not out of some grand desire to change the world. But now, as the days dragged on, he realized how much the world was changing around him, and how much it expected him to change. At home, things were quieter, but no less complicated. His mother, Trina, was proud of him. But even she saw the burden of all the attention weighing on her son. Malik tried to ignore it. He tried to slip back into the life he knew. His old routines, his favorite songs, his evening walks around the neighborhood. But everything felt different. His phone never stopped buzzing, and the constant barrage of messages, both supportive and demanding, had begun to blur together. Malik started turning it off more often, hiding it away in a drawer, trying to regain a sense of peace. His uncle Xavier, the rock he had always relied on, was now more present than ever, managing the media attention, the public outcry, the legal consequences. But even Xavier couldn't shield him from the overwhelming pressure. Malik found himself wondering more and more whether he had made the right choice by standing up when he did. Sure, the world seemed to agree with him, but what about the weight of all the eyes on him now? Was it worth it? One afternoon, while sitting in the park near his house, Malik found himself lost in thought, staring at the sunset. He hadn't realized how much his life had changed until that moment. The silence around him felt loud, almost deafening, as if the world outside was pressing against him, waiting for him to make the next move. But Malik didn't know what that move was. The truth was, he wasn't ready for what had happened to him. He wasn't ready for the world to place its expectations on him. But in the silence of that moment, Malik realized something. He couldn't go back. The moment on the plane, His calm defiance, his refusal to be erased, had changed everything, not just for the people who had watched but for him as well. He had stepped into something bigger, something he hadn't chosen. And now he had to figure out how to live with it. He had to figure out who he was in this new world that saw him as something more than just Malik Torrance, the teenager from Sacramento. And deep down, amidst the uncertainty, Malik knew one thing. He couldn't let the weight of the world break him. Days blurred into weeks, and life, though it had irrevocably changed, began to resume its inevitable march. Malik still walked the halls of his high school, though it wasn't the same. Every step felt like it echoed louder than before. Every glance from classmates felt heavier. He no longer blended into the background, a quiet presence in a sea of faces. Now he was that kid, the one whose name everyone knew, the one who had stood up to an airline and sparked a conversation that had captured the world's attention. The weight of the world felt even heavier in the quiet moments. When he was alone, sitting in his room, staring at his phone as it buzzed incessantly with texts, emails, and messages from people he didn't know. His inbox had transformed into a constant flood of well-meaning but overwhelming support. There were messages of admiration, encouragement, and, yes, a few that were far less kind. But amidst it all, Malik couldn't shake the quiet, gnawing question. What now? At first, the support felt validating. The countless people who reached out to tell him he was their hero, who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles, were encouraging. But slowly, that praise began to feel like a weight, something he hadn't asked for but was now expected to carry. He didn't want to be the symbol of a movement. He didn't want to be someone's example of courage in the face of injustice. He just wanted to finish school, make it through the next day, and try to feel like himself again. But he couldn't ignore the fact that his actions had meant something, had changed something. As the stories continued to spread, the world outside his small circle of family and friends had begun to take notice. Malik's simple, quiet refusal to back down had sparked conversations about racial bias, corporate accountability, and what it meant to stand up when the odds were against you. People he didn't know were calling him brave, calling him strong, and Malik couldn't help but wonder if they saw the same thing he did. Because in those moments on the plane, he hadn't been thinking about bravery. He had just been trying to be human, trying to get the respect he deserved. In the days following the incident, the messages of support and solidarity continued to pour in. But there were also messages of pressure, messages from organizations wanting to use his story for their own causes, wanting to make him a spokesperson for something he wasn't ready to be. Malik realized that, for the first time, he wasn't just living his own life anymore. His actions had made him part of something bigger than himself, and that reality both inspired him and terrified him. He turned off his phone more often now. He didn't want to be the kid who everyone expected to have all the answers. He wasn't ready to lead any movements. But as he sat quietly in his room, his thoughts turned inward, and he realized something that had eluded him before. Malik Torrance wasn't just the kid on the plane. He was someone who had been seen, not just by the people who had stood up for him, but by himself. For the first time, he understood that silence and composure in the face of injustice could be louder than any shout. Maybe he wasn't done with the world just yet, but Malik wasn't ready to let the world define him either. It was time to find his own way forward. The journey Malik had unwittingly embarked on was one no teenager should ever have to face. Yet, in those quiet moments, when the noise of the world seemed to rise to a deafening crescendo, he had discovered something profoundly important, something that had shifted the way he saw himself and the world around him. What started as an innocent trip home, a simple act of boarding a flight, had turned into an encounter with something much bigger. The realities of racial bias, the weight of public scrutiny, and the power of one person's quiet defiance. Malik didn't ask for the attention, and he certainly didn't seek to become the face of a movement. But in standing firm, in choosing not to let someone else's cruelty define him, Malik learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes the most profound impact comes not from grand gestures, but from the small, courageous decisions we make every day that he hadn't expected to become a symbol. He hadn't expected to be part of a conversation about systemic inequality or racial injustice. All he wanted was to sit down, to be seen as a person with dignity, like anyone else. But in that moment of quiet resistance, Malik became much more than just a passenger on a plane. He became the spark that ignited a much-needed discussion about how we treat one another, how small actions can reverberate through society, and how standing up, even in the most seemingly insignificant moments, can ripple out to create meaningful change. For Malik, the experience was both painful and eye-opening. He had never imagined that something so small could make such a big difference. But in the process, he learned the power of his own voice. More importantly, he learned that silence could be a tool not of submission but of resistance. His calm in the face of aggression became the loudest statement of all, and the world heard it. What Malik didn't anticipate, however, was how this experience would shape him long after the headlines faded. The attention, the support, the pressure, it all began to shift the way he saw his place in the world. He realized that when you stand up for what's right, you don't just change the world around you. You change yourself. It's not always easy, and it doesn't always feel comfortable. But the lessons you take with you from those moments of adversity become the foundation upon which you build the rest of your life. Malik's story teaches us that we don't need to have all the answers to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stand firm, to believe in our own worth, and to demand respect. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to influence the world in our own unique way. Whether it's in the quiet, subtle moments, or the ones that make headlines as we watch Malik's journey unfold, we are reminded of the importance of empathy, the need to speak out against injustice, and the undeniable truth that each of us is capable of more than we think. Malik's story is just one example of how ordinary people, when given the chance, can spark extraordinary change. His strength, his courage, and his resilience are lessons we can all carry with us. So, if Malik's story moved you, if it inspired you to think differently, or if it just reminded you of the power we all have to create change, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Join us in continuing these important conversations, share your thoughts, and let's keep pushing for a world where respect, dignity, and kindness are at the core of everything we do. Thank you for listening, and remember, your voice matters.